Does one big meal cause you to gain weight? In this video, I'm going to discuss what really happens when you overeat and why. Excuse my raspy voice, but I picked up a cold when we moved. So while the audio is subpar, the content is top level. So stick around. Let's say you overate yesterday and your scale jumped up today, so it must be fat, right? Well, probably not. In reality, most of what happens after an overeating episode has little to do with fat gain at all. When you overeat, what's most likely on the plate? Pizza, comfort foods, dessert, or something else? Let me know in the comments. Hi, I'm Dr. Jake, and today we're separating the immediate physiological responses from the long-term consequences of overeating. Overeating triggers a predictable set of physiological responses: digestive, hormonal, and metabolic, and most of them resolve quickly. Others develop only when excess intake is repeated over time. Understanding the difference is the key to making better health choices without fear or overreaction. The key difference is time. What happens in your body the few hours after a big meal is very different from what happens when overeating becomes a pattern over months or even years. Today we're walking through both scientifically to dispel the myths and hype that fill popular nutrition narratives and clickbait metabolism talk. So let's start with what happens right after a single time of overeating. Your stomach stretches beyond its normal volume, which we all have felt, because that stretch sends signals to your brain telling you you're full, sometimes very full. The problem is that hunger signals are faster than satiety signals, meaning you can still feel hungry even though you're already full. At the same time, gastric emptying slows and acid production increases, which is why bloating, pressure, and reflux are common after overeating. But it's not permanent damage. It's your digestive system responding to the larger volume, which will eventually subside. In the meantime, blood sugar enters the picture. Large meals, especially those high in refined carbohydrates, raise blood sugar, and your pancreas responds by releasing insulin. Insulin helps move the glucose out of the bloodstream and into tissues like your muscle and liver. For some people, this shows up as a post-meal sleepiness or heavy sluggish feeling, and that's where a lot of the confusion starts. You often hear that a large meal causes an insulin spike, and that insulin spike somehow forces your body to store fat. That sounds convincing, but it leaves out how insulin actually works. Insulin's primary job is nutrient handling, not fat gain. After a large meal, insulin rises because it's supposed to, which is normal, expected, and necessary. A single insulin spike doesn't cause weight gain. In fact, after a big meal, a large portion of the calories go towards refilling glycogen levels, the stored carbohydrate in your muscles and liver. And this is key. Glycogen storage comes before fat storage. Only when glycogen levels are full and excess calories continue to come in does fat storage increase in a meaningful way. This is why one overeating episode doesn't turn into pounds of body fat overnight. The physiology simply doesn't work that way. Where insulin does become part of the problem is with repetition. When insulin is elevated frequently, meal after meal, day after day, tissues gradually become less sensitive to it. That's insulin resistance. At that point, fat storage does become easier, fat release becomes harder, and blood sugar control worsens. So insulin isn't the villain. Chronic energy or calorie intake is. Blaming insulin spikes for weight gain is like blaming your speedometer for speeding. It's responding to what's happening, not causing it. So what explains the increased weight you see from the scale after one overeating episode? It's almost entirely water. Sodium from your meal pulls water out of the bloodstream, which you retain, and glycogen storage carries water with it. This is why your fingers may feel puffy, rings get tight, and the scale jumps up quickly. It's not fat, it's fluid. There's also a short-term inflammatory response, especially after very large or high-fat meals. In healthy people, this inflammatory response is temporary and resolves once normal eating resumes. Even the gut microbiome shifts briefly. A single binge can increase gas production or change stool patterns for a day or two. But the gut is resilient, and normal eating restores balance quickly. There's also another piece that people rarely hear about. Digestion and processing a meal actually burns calories. The larger the meal, the more energy your body spends breaking it down, absorbing nutrients, and putting them where they belong. That doesn't mean overeating burns itself off, but it does show that the body's not a passive storage tank. Some of the calories you eat are immediately used just to handle the meal itself. This reinforces the same point. One meal doesn't translate into immediate fat gain. So the real problem isn't one meal. It starts when overeating becomes frequent enough that the body doesn't recover before the next meal. When that happens, the body has to decide where to put the excess energy, and the safest places to store it is fat tissue. At first, the storage of excess energy causes existing fat cells to get larger as they fill with triglycerides and expand. This works for a while, and in fact, it's protective. Proper energy storage keeps fat away from organs like liver and muscle, but fat cells can only grow so much. As fat cells begin to overfill, they function poorly. Large fat cells become less responsive to insulin and more likely to release inflammatory signals. They also start leaking fatty acids into the bloodstream, especially between meals. And those fatty acids don't just disappear. They get taken up by muscle and liver tissue where they interfere with insulin signaling. Muscle becomes less effective at pulling glucose out of the blood, and the liver keeps producing glucose when it shouldn't. So the pancreas compensates by releasing more insulin. This is how insulin resistance begins. Not with one binge, but repeated cycles of storage without recovery or normal eating. When fat cells reach their expansion limit, the body adapts by creating new fat cells. This increases total energy storage capacity and temporarily reduces metabolic stress. But there's long-term costs. Once new fat cells are created, they tend to stick around. During weight loss, those fat cells shrink, but they never disappear. The smaller and more numerous fat cells send stronger hunger signals and are primed to be filled. This is part of why weight regain after dieting is so common. It's largely physiological, not just willpower. So over time with chronic eating, insulin is elevated more often, fat tissues become more inflammatory, and fat storage becomes easier. This locks the body into a less flexible metabolic state, making it harder for the body to compensate for all that overeating. And the key distinction that most people miss because they hear it so often on social media is that insulin resistance is not caused by a single insulin spike. It's caused by fat tissue being pushed into storage mode over and over again without enough time spent in balance. A quick note on binge eating. It's important to separate overeating from binge eating disorder. Binge eating involves a loss of control and psychological distress, not just calories. It's associated with greater weight cycling, higher cardiometabolic risk, and poor mental health outcomes. That's why aggressive restriction and punishment strategies often backfire. Effective treatment focuses on behavioral therapy, psychological support, and restoring normal hunger and fullness cues. Now, as an exercise physiologist, I gotta throw in on how exercise does some good without going to extremes. After overeating, light to moderate exercise helps the muscles pull glucose out of the bloodstream without needing much insulin at all. Muscle contraction itself increases glucose uptake, which means blood sugar comes down without needing much insulin at all. Exercise also helps drain glycogen stores, which are filled by the large meal. That doesn't mean you're burning off the meal in a punishment sense. It just means you're restoring balance. When glucose from subsequent meals can be stored as glycogen, that means less of it will get routed towards fat storage. And there's also a digestion benefit. Walking or easy movement after a meal improves gastric emptying and reduces bloating and reflux in many people. In other words, it helps you feel better faster. And importantly, exercise improves insulin sensitivity for hours, sometimes up to a full day after a large meal. That means the calories from the next meal are handled more efficiently. And you don't need a brutal workout. A brisk walk, a bike ride, or a normal training session are enough. Extreme compensatory workouts can increase stress hormones and often backfire. So exercise shouldn't be about undoing overeating. It's about helping your physiology reset. So after a big meal, the best thing you do is nothing dramatic. Drink water, go for a walk, and eat normally the next meal. Remember, you can make things worse by trying to undo those calories by skipping the next meal or over-exercising. Those behaviors can often increase stress hormones and set up the next binge. And your body is better at handling occasional excesses rather than chronic extremes. So remember, your health isn't determined by one meal, one day, or a holiday binge. It's shaped by patterns or what happens most of the time. So enjoy the celebration, but respect the long game. And don't let a single plate of food ruin your holiday or celebration. But do commit to healthier eating and more activity afterwards. Click like, subscribe, and share with someone who you know may benefit from watching this video. Thanks. As always, my answers come from peer-reviewed research.